They said it was for the greater good when they shut down my son's life support. Government overreach at its worst, right in our own neighborhood. My boy turned blue, fighting for every breath while bureaucrats enforced their precious regulations. They almost took my son from me, so I took everything from them. What would you do if unelected officials gambled with your child's life? At 55, after serving in the military and working 30 years in construction, I finally saved enough to buy our dream property in Pine Creek Estates. Not one of those cookie-cutter houses in the subdivision, but a 5-acre lot with an old farmhouse and barn at the edge of the development. The doctors said rural air would be better for Jason's lungs, and I wanted space where a man could breathe free, ironic considering what happened later. My wife Sarah, my 18-year-old son Jason, and I thought we'd found the perfect balance, close enough to the community for support, but with the independence of rural living. I spent weekends fixing up the old barn, converting part of it into my workshop. By day, I ran my construction crew, building the new hospital in town, but evenings and weekends, I was working my own land. The kind of life where neighbors still wave when you drive by and bring casseroles when someone's sick. And sick is something my boy knows too well. Jason was born with cystic fibrosis. His lungs don't work like yours or mine. Every breath is a battle for him. He needs continuous oxygen support and medical equipment running 24/7. Equipment that depends on electricity to keep him alive. When we first toured the house, I was up front with the realtor and the community welcome committee. Showed them Jason's medical documentation, explained about the equipment we'd need to install. They seemed understanding. Even helped us find the best spots for the backup generator and external equipment that keeps my son breathing when regular power isn't reliable. For 2 whole years, things were peaceful. Our neighbors brought us home-cooked meals during Jason's hospital stays. The previous HOA president, a retired doctor, even helped us navigate insurance paperwork for specialized equipment. We planted roots here, built a wheelchair-accessible garden where Jason could grow his own vegetables when he had good days. I renovated parts of the house to make it easier for him to get around during flare-ups. We weren't just living here. We were building a future. I remember sitting on our back porch that first summer, watching Jason actually laugh while playing chess with the neighbor's kid. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe life had finally cut us a break. But that all changed when the HOA leadership turned over and Christine Winters stepped into the picture. And suddenly, the dream home we'd sacrificed everything for became the battleground for my son's right to breathe. Everything changed when Christine Winters became HOA president, a former state environmental regulator with political ambitions and that practice smile that never quite reaches her eyes. The first HOA meeting with her in charge felt different. Where the previous leadership focused on community events and neighborhood improvements, Christine arrived with color-coded binders and talk of modernizing standards. She immediately implemented what she called a green community initiative with strict energy usage limits for every household. According to her, individual liberty had to be balanced against collective responsibilities. Those weren't suggestions, they were mandates. Each house received a carbon allowance based on square footage and number of occupants. Our medical equipment immediately put us way over the limit. When the first warning letter arrived, I thought surely this was a misunderstanding. I called Christine that same day, explained about Jason's condition, reminded her of the documentation we'd provided when we moved in. I even invited her to our home to see exactly what equipment was necessary to keep my son alive. Her response? Personal hardships don't exempt anyone from community obligations, Mr. Henderson. Perhaps you should consider more energy-efficient medical alternatives. More efficient alternatives? As if we were talking about switching to LED light bulbs, not life support equipment prescribed by specialists. At the next HOA meeting, I brought Jason's pulmonologist on speakerphone to explain the situation. The doctor detailed how Jason's oxygen concentrator, nebulizer, and monitoring equipment were all medically necessary and could not be compromised. Some neighbors nodded in understanding. A few even spoke up on our behalf, ordinary folks recognizing the insanity of what was happening. For a moment, I thought common sense might prevail. But then I watched Christine's face, that practiced mask of authority, never slipping as she made deliberate notes in her leather-bound planner. Without even acknowledging the doctor's testimony, she simply turned the page and moved on to the next agenda item. Moving on to community landscaping requirements. Her voice carried on as if my son's life was just an inconvenient bullet point that had been addressed and dismissed. It was then I realized this wasn't just bureaucratic indifference. This was calculated control. When I confronted her after the meeting, she lowered her voice and said, "The community has voted for progress, Mr. Henderson. Individual exceptions undermine collective goals. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand. How had keeping my son alive become a political statement? My only small victory came a week later when I managed to convince 2 board members, older residents who'd known Jason since we moved in, to grant us a temporary medical exemption. Christine couldn't override them without calling a special vote, and she didn't have the numbers yet. That exemption bought us 3 months. But I could see in Christine's tight smile at the next community barbecue that this wasn't over. She had simply shifted strategies. "Your temporary exemption is certainly fortunate," she said, sipping her iced tea while glancing pointedly at our house. "Though I do worry about the precedent it sets. Once we start making exceptions, where does it end? Rules exist for everyone's benefit, after all." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "My son's life isn't a precedent, Mrs. Winters. It's not an exception or a talking point. It's everything to me." She just smiled that practice smile and walked away. But I saw something in her eyes that should have warned me. This wasn't about the environment or community standards. This was about control. And Christine Winters wasn't used to being challenged. First came the fines. $100 daily for willfully exceeding community energy quotas. I contested each one, filing appeals with documentation from Jason's doctors. But Christine had already rigged the system against us. She'd restructured the appeals process to bypass the full board, rerouting complaints directly to her newly created Environmental Compliance Committee, 3 people handpicked for their unwavering loyalty to her agenda. The fines kept coming. $3,000 the first month, nearly $4,000 the second. Money we needed for Jason's medications and treatments, now going into HOA coffers. Then came the mandatory smart meters. Christine called them energy accountability tools. The HOA hired a tech company to install them on every home, allowing them to monitor power usage in real time. They could now track exactly when and how much electricity we were using down to individual outlets. At an emergency board meeting, I demanded to know how this invasion of privacy was legal. Christine smoothly cited page 237 of the HOA bylaws, which apparently gave them authority to implement community-wide infrastructure improvements without a full resident vote. The bylaws were written 20 years ago, I argued. They weren't thinking about surveillance devices. "The language is quite clear, Mr. Henderson," she replied. "Perhaps you should have read the fine print before purchasing your home." When our first smart meter report arrived, it included a detailed breakdown highlighting our excessive usage in red. There was even a section comparing our consumption to our neighbors, showing we used 4 times more electricity than the community average. Of course we did. Most of our neighbors weren't keeping their children alive with medical equipment. That's when I installed our backup generator, paid for by cashing in part of my pension fund early. A heavy-duty system installed behind our garage that could power Jason's equipment for days if needed. I made sure it met all county building codes and safety regulations. Less than 48 hours later, Christine was at our door with a violation notice. The generator was apparently non-compliant with community environmental standards and visually disruptive to neighborhood aesthetics. We had 7 days to remove it or face additional fines. I showed her the county permits. "This is fully legal and up to code," I insisted. "County regulations are minimum standards, Mr. Henderson. Our community holds itself to higher ones." Then came the medical verification requirements. Monthly doctor's notes to prove Jason's condition still necessitated excessive energy consumption, as if cystic fibrosis might mysteriously disappear overnight. Each new form required notarization and submission in triplicate. Each submission triggered a processing fee. Each approval took longer than the last, creating gaps where we were technically operating without authorization. I consulted a lawyer. who reviewed our situation and shook his head. "They're operating within technical legal boundaries," he explained. "HOAs have remarkable power in this state. Fighting this could take years and tens of thousands in legal fees." We couldn't afford a lengthy legal battle. Not with Jason's medical bills already stretching our finances to the breaking point. My small victory came when I secured comprehensive legal documentation from Jason's entire medical team. A 50-page binder with statements from his pulmonologist, cardiologist, and 3 specialists, all testifying to the absolute necessity of his equipment. I submitted this through certified mail to every board member individually, with copies to their personal emails, creating a legal paper trail they couldn't ignore. Christine was furious, but couldn't override such extensive medical documentation without risking personal liability. She was forced to grant us a conditional exemption, though she added requirements for quarterly reviews and emission offset fees. This wasn't about property values anymore. It wasn't even about the environment. This was about control, bureaucratic power flexed for its own sake by people who had forgotten that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. I thought we'd reached a difficult but sustainable compromise. But as it turns out, Christine wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And she was about to cross a line that would change everything between us. Then came that sweltering August afternoon. The temperature hit 98 degrees by noon, the kind of heat that makes the air itself feel heavy. Jason was having a rough day, his oxygen levels already lower than normal because of the heat. I got the HOA email at work. Standard community notification about a scheduled grid maintenance shutdown for just 2 hours, from 2 to 4 p.m. What wasn't standard was that our street wasn't on the distribution list. Everyone else in the neighborhood received 72 hours notice, except us. I only saw it because a coworker who lived nearby mentioned it. I immediately called home, told Jason to make sure the backup generator was ready to switch on. He assured me he knew the procedure. We'd practiced it enough times. I tried calling Christine too, leaving messages about our medical exemption and the critical need for advance notification. No response. At 2:15, our power went out as scheduled. Our backup generator kicked in automatically, just as it was designed to do. Jason texted me that everything was working fine. I felt relieved and went back to finishing up at the construction site. 20 minutes later, without warning, HOA security personnel entered our property. 2 men in uniforms with the Pine Creek Estates logo on their chests. They claimed our generator violated new noise and emission ordinances that had apparently been passed in a closed executive session the previous night. Jason called me in a panic as they demanded to shut down the generator. I told them to put me on speaker, explained our medical exemption, the life or death nature of the situation. They didn't care. One of them was reading directly from a laminated card. Per HOA Regulation 15.3c, non-compliant equipment must be deactivated immediately regardless of resident objections. I told Jason to lock the doors, that I was on my way home. But these men had keys, master keys provided by the HOA, for emergency enforcement. They forced entry through our back door and manually shut down the generator. Jason tried to stop them, but what chance did an 18-year-old with compromised lungs have against 2 grown men? With the generator disabled, Jason's oxygen system failed. The battery backup was designed for gradual shutdown, not for when someone forcibly cuts power. Jason tried to reach the emergency oxygen tanks, but in the heat and stress, he collapsed on our front porch, struggling for air. Thank God for Mrs. Abernathy next door. She heard the commotion and found Jason blue-lipped and barely conscious. Called 911 while trying to help him breathe. By the time the paramedics arrived, Jason's blood oxygen had dropped to dangerous levels. By the time I screeched into our driveway, they were loading him into the ambulance, oxygen mask already on his face. The doctors later told us if Mrs. Abernathy hadn't found him when she did, if the ambulance had been 5 minutes slower, Jason would have suffered permanent brain damage, or worse. All because Christine Winters decided her rules mattered more than my son's life. When I arrived at our farmhouse, an ambulance was already parked in the gravel driveway. The paramedics had wheeled Jason out from the house and had him on a stretcher near the barn where I'd installed his backup equipment. equipment they disconnected. His skin was still frighteningly pale, his chest rising and falling in desperate, shallow movements, the farmland stretching behind them in cruel contrast to his struggle for air. I jumped out of my truck, work boots hitting the gravel hard, construction dust still on my clothes. I ran to him, grabbed his hand. "I'm here, son. I'm here now." That's when I saw her. Christine Winters, standing off to the side, arms crossed over her tailored navy business suit. She was watching the whole scene with this detached expression, like she was observing a minor inconvenience rather than the near death of a teenager. Something snapped inside me. 20 years of controlling my temper, of playing by the rules, of being the reasonable one, gone in an instant. I stormed toward her, closing the distance in 4 angry strides, pointing my finger directly at her face. "You did this," I shouted, my voice breaking with rage and fear. "Your rules almost killed my son." The paramedics were loading Jason into the ambulance as Christine coolly adjusted her pearl earring. "We were simply enforcing community guidelines, Mr. Henderson. Perhaps this incident highlights why your family might not be." I didn't let her finish. "This isn't over," I promised, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Not by a long shot." For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw fear flash across her face, real fear, as she recognized something in my eyes. Something that told her this wasn't just another homeowner she could bully into submission. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy thud. The siren started its wail as they pulled away with my son inside. Christine and I stood there in my driveway, the air between us charged with something that went beyond neighborhood disputes. This was war now, and she had no idea what was coming. In that hospital room, watching machines do the breathing my son couldn't do himself, something changed inside me. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked time as I sat by Jason's bed for hours, holding his hand while he slept. I'd served my country, built infrastructure with my bare hands, paid every tax they'd ever demanded, never asked for handouts, never expected special treatment, just wanted to live and let live. And now a group of power-hungry bureaucrats with clipboards and rulebooks had nearly killed my boy. For what? So Christine could add another accomplishment to her resume? So she could brag about carbon reduction at her next political fundraiser? Sarah arrived from her nursing shift, still in her scrubs, eyes red from crying. "How could they do this?" she whispered, stroking Jason's hair. "How could they just turn off his oxygen?" I had no answer that made sense, because it didn't make sense. This wasn't about homeowners associations anymore. This wasn't about neighborhood rules or community standards. This was about fighting back against people who think they have the right to control your life, your very breath, because they've given themselves fancy titles and printed themselves official-looking badges. When Jason finally woke up, groggy from the sedatives, his first words shattered something fundamental inside me. "Dad," he whispered, his voice raspy from the intubation, tears welling in his eyes. I was so scared. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't breathe. He gripped my hand with surprising strength. "They just wouldn't listen to me, Dad. They said it was the rules." That word, rules, hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. In that moment, I made a silent vow that would reshape everything that followed. Those people would never again sleep peacefully in the homes they valued more than my son's life. Something hardened in me then, a decision made not in anger, but in cold, clear certainty. I kissed my son's forehead and made him a silent promise. This would never happen again. Not to Jason. Not to anyone. I stepped into the hallway, pulled out my phone, and made 3 calls. First to an old Army buddy who now worked in banking. Second to my former partner in the construction business who had connections in real estate. Third to my cousin who practiced corporate law. "It's John," I said to each of them. "I need a favor. A big one." The plan forming in my mind wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure people who abuse power face consequences. Real consequences. The kind that hit them where it hurts most. For Christine Winters, that wasn't her conscience. It was her carefully constructed life of privilege and control. I started digging. The kind of detailed research I'd learned doing estimates for construction bids. Leaving no stone unturned. Turns out Christine Winters, age 42, former state environmental regulator with political aspirations, had secrets. So did board members Michael Harrison, 56, Patricia Donovan, 49, and David Matthews, 51. They all projected success and stability. But under the surface? Financial quicksand. They'd each leveraged themselves to the hilt, playing the real estate market like a casino. Multiple mortgages, second homes, investment properties purchased at peak prices with minimal down payments. The kind of high-risk financial moves that only work when markets keep rising. Their celebrated Green Community Initiative. I found the paper trail. It was just a front to push through exclusive development deals for approved green builders they had financial connections with. Companies that donated to Christine's exploratory committee for her state Senate run. Companies where Michael and David held silent partnership stakes. I contacted old buddies from my military days who now worked in banking. Men who understood loyalty and favors. Men who knew what it meant when bureaucrats got drunk on power. John Henderson calling in that marker was all I needed to say. Doors opened. Information flowed. I called in favors from contractors I'd helped over the decades. Plumbers I'd bailed out at 2 a.m. when their big jobs went sideways. Electricians whose kids I'd hired when no one else would take a chance on them. My first small victory came when my friend at the county clerk's office, whose daughter's wedding venue I'd helped rebuild after a fire, gave me access to their financial disclosures. These power-hungry bureaucrats were drowning in debt, keeping up appearances while barely staying afloat. Then came my breakthrough discovery, the Achilles heel in their armor. They'd all refinanced their homes through the same struggling bank last year. A small regional institution desperate for liquidity, quietly selling off its mortgage portfolio to larger financial players. The perfect opportunity was staring me right in the face. I liquidated my retirement accounts, took out loans against my business equipment, even sold the vacation cabin I'd been renovating for our retirement. Sarah didn't ask questions when I explained what I needed the money for. She just nodded and said, "Make it right." When all was said and done, I had put together nearly $2 million. Not enough to buy a corporation or finance a political campaign, but enough for what I needed to do. Enough to teach Christine Winters and her cronies that when you gamble with someone's life, you'd better be prepared to lose everything you have. The pieces were in place. All I needed now was the right moment to spring the trap. When interest rates spiked that fall, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The Federal Reserve raised rates 3/4 of a point, and suddenly overextended homeowners were feeling the squeeze. Especially those with adjustable rate mortgages and multiple properties, people exactly like Christine and her board members. That's when I executed my plan, a strategy no HOA regulation could defend against. Through 5 separate LLCs registered in different states, untraceable to me on paper, I approached that small regional bank holding their mortgages. My pitch was calculated perfection. I buy these specific loans at full face value, no questions asked. For a banking industry drowning in bad debt and desperate for liquidity, it was an offer that bypassed all normal procedures. They didn't see justice in motion, they just saw guaranteed cash, while other banks were posting losses. The perfect legal checkmate that no attorney could unravel. They didn't ask questions about why I wanted these particular mortgages. Money talks, and $2 million talks very loudly indeed. Within 6 weeks, I owned the debt on each board member's primary residence. Christine's Colonial on Maple Drive. Michael's Ranch Style on Oakwood Lane. Patricia's Townhouse in the East Section. David's Renovated Craftsman on Pine Circle. They had no idea I now controlled their financial futures, that I held the notes to their precious homes. I let things sit for a month. Let them go about their business, holding their petty HOA meetings, sending out their violation notices, feeling secure in their power. All while I waited for the perfect moment. That moment came with their big annual Sustainable Community Awards ceremony, their self-congratulatory event of the year. They'd rented out the country club ballroom, invited local politicians and press. Christine was giving the keynote address on community governance in the climate action era. I hired 4 professional couriers in suits to arrive simultaneously, each carrying an identical envelope. Timed it so they would be delivered precisely during Christine's speech about shared sacrifice for the greater good. The envelopes contained notices of immediate foreclosure proceedings due to violations of mortgage terms. You see, buried in the fine print of their loan agreements was a moral character clause, standard boilerplate that nobody reads. It stated that any act deemed detrimental to human welfare by the note holder could trigger immediate demand for full payment. Cutting off a child's oxygen supply qualified. The courier handed Christine her envelope right at the podium. The other 3 board members received theirs as they sat at the head table. I paid extra for the couriers to wait and confirm receipt. From my seat in the back of the room, I watched Christine's face transform as she opened that envelope, a front row seat to justice unfolding in real time. First came confusion, her brow furrowing as she scanned the document. Then disbelief, her eyes widening as she read it a second time. Finally, the devastating moment of comprehension crashed over her like a wave. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped her reading glasses, the clatter audible in the suddenly quiet room. In that precise moment, all her power, all her control vanished, and she knew it. The tables had turned completely, and I savored every second of watching the realization sink in. Michael started yelling into his phone, already calling his lawyer. Patricia knocked over a water glass in shock. David just sat there, the color draining from his face as he read the document over and over. The ceremony collapsed into chaos. Guests whispering, phones coming out, rumors spreading in real time. The journalist from the local paper, who I'd anonymously tipped off that morning, was taking notes furiously. Christine tried to regain control, tapping the microphone. Just a minor business matter, she assured everyone with a frozen smile. Let's continue with our celebration of community excellence. But nobody was listening anymore. The facade had cracked. The mighty had fallen. As people began filing out, confused and concerned, I made direct eye contact with Christine across the room. I didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at her steadily until recognition dawned in her eyes. Until she knew exactly who was behind this. The look on her face in that moment, the shock, the fear, the dawning understanding that she'd picked the wrong family to target, that was a moment of sweet satisfaction I'll remember until my dying day. But this wasn't just about the sweet taste of revenge in that moment. It was about lasting justice, about changing the system itself. And that meant Christine needed to understand exactly what she'd done and why her world was now crumbling around her. The justice I saw wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. Para la siguiente sección, necesito aproximadamente 525 palabras para cubrir 3.5 minutos a una the next day. Christine stormed into my hospital construction site, her perfect computer completely shattered. Gone was the tailored suit, replaced by hastily thrown-on casual clothes. Her normally immaculate hair was pulled back carelessly, her eyes wild with panic and rage. "You can't do this to us," she shouted, pushing past my foreman. Workers stopped hammering, turned to watch. "This is illegal harassment. I've already called my attorney." I calmly set down my clipboard, took off my hard hat, and led her to my temporary office, a converted storage container at the edge of the site. "By all means, involve your attorneys," I said once the door closed. "But before you waste what little money you have left, you should know that everything I've done is perfectly legal. I own your mortgages. Fair and square. This is about your son," she said, realization dawning. "You're destroying our lives over a misunderstanding about community standards." That's when I lost my calm. Slammed my hand down on the metal desk, so hard it echoed through the container. A misunderstanding? My son nearly died because you decided your rules were more important than his life. I pulled out my phone, showed her the photo of Jason on the ventilator, tubes running from his mouth, eyes closed, skin still with that terrible gray undertone. "You did this to him. You and your board. You nearly killed an 18-year-old boy because his medical equipment didn't fit your vision of a perfect neighborhood." For the first time, I saw something like shame cross Christine's face. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by calculation. "What do you want? Money? An apology? I'm prepared to issue a formal statement regarding the unfortunate." "I don't want your words," I interrupted. I want change. Real change. I laid out my terms. Resign immediately from the HOA board, all 4 of them. Abolish all energy restriction policies for medical needs, with permanent exemptions written into the bylaws. Fire the security team that removed our generator and publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing. And establish a medical freedom fund with their own money, $50,000 each, to help residents with health conditions. That's extortion, she whispered. That's consequence. I corrected her. For the first time in your life, you're facing some. You have 48 hours to comply. Otherwise, eviction proceedings begin. I hear the homeless shelter downtown has a 3-month waiting list. She tried another angle, her voice softening. John, be reasonable. We have families too. Homes we've worked for. Surely we can find a compromise that— Tick-tock, Christine, I said, opening the door to show her out. 48 hours. Your choice. As she walked back to her car, shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt no pleasure. No triumph. Just a grim satisfaction that finally, she understood what it felt like to be powerless. To have someone else control your fate. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or committees. Sometimes it comes from a father who refuses to let anyone harm his son, and who has the means to do something about it. They had no choice but to accept. All 4 signed resignation letters within 36 hours. The security company was terminated. The Medical Freedom Fund, established with their personal checks, grudgingly written but legally binding. An emergency community meeting was called. Attendance was nearly perfect. Word had spread fast about what happened to Jason and about the foreclosure notices at the award ceremony. Neighbors who'd never spoken up before found their voices. A retired nurse stood up and shared how her request for accommodations for her husband's CPAP machine had been repeatedly denied. A young couple revealed they'd been hiding their daughter's epilepsy monitoring equipment for fear of violations. Stories poured out of intimidation, of arbitrary enforcement, of a community living in fear of their own homeowners association. The new HOA board was elected that night. It now includes residents with medical backgrounds and focuses on actual community needs instead of control. All households with medical necessities are exempt from any usage restrictions, permanently, in writing, with no review process or expiration date. Jason's equipment runs without interference, with a legally protected right to backup systems. No smart meters monitoring our usage, no surprise inspections, no monthly paperwork proving we deserve to keep our son alive. The Medical Freedom Fund has already helped 3 families upgrade their medical equipment to more efficient models, not because they're forced to, but because they want to contribute to the community while still meeting their health needs. The sweetest victory came at the next quarterly meeting, where I was unanimously voted in as head of the safety committee. My first act was to establish emergency preparedness protocols for residents with medical conditions, ensuring everyone has backup plans for power outages and severe weather. Christine and her cronies still own their homes, barely. I could have forced them out, made them homeless like they threatened to do to so many others. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice and change. They've lost their standing in the community. Christine's political aspirations are finished. Hard to run for state office when your local paper has covered how you cut off a teenager's oxygen. Michael's consulting business has lost clients. Patricia and David keep to themselves now, and whenever they see me in the neighborhood, they quickly turn and walk away. That look in their eyes, it's not just fear, it's understanding. They finally comprehend that their actions have consequences. That power comes with responsibility. That treating people like obstacles to your ambition eventually catches up with you. As for us, Jason is doing better. The stress of constant HOA harassment had been taking a toll on his health, but now he's back to his projects and plans. Talking about college, about the future. A future he might not have had if things had gone differently that August afternoon. Some call what I did extreme. Maybe it was. But when unelected officials with nothing but titles they gave themselves try to control your family's right to survive, when they gamble with your child's next breath, there are no rules left worth following. I don't regret a single thing. Not the money spent, not the sleepless nights planning, not the hardball tactics. When it comes to protecting your family, There's no such thing as going too far. Christine and her board learn a lesson that too many people in power never face. Ordinary citizens aren't powerless. We might be patient. We might play by the rules for years. But push us too far, threaten what we love most, and we become a force they never saw coming. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to become something they fear more than death itself. A father who will stop at nothing to protect his son's right to breathe free. Because when you've held your child's hand in a hospital bed, wondering if they'll take another breath, there's nothing in this world you wouldn't do to keep them safe. Nothing. And that's something bureaucrats with their rulebooks and committees will never understand. Until they face a parent who's finally had enough.